Lundwall contends that far from being ignorant and backward savages, the pre-literate cultures that created mankind's most ancient mythological tales had a high degree of intellectual sophistication. Kirkus Review.
We are Myth Vision.
Welcome back, guys, gals. Derek Lambert here, your host. Dr. Luther G. Williams still editing the book. Go down there in the PayPal, the link in the description. Show him some love. Give him some money, if you will, to help him out with his book so that he can get this thing published. He's been published before, and he's trying to get this thing done. I figure you guys would be able to help him out. Also, I want to give a big shout out to Mythicist Milwaukee. Mythicist Milwaukee are the people who actually helped inspire this podcast and what we're about to do. We have a special guest with us today, and this debate that took place between Dr. Bart Ehrman and Dr. Robert McNair Price. How are you, sir?
Doing great. I hope you're the same.
I am doing wonderful. Hopefully this internet connection holds for us during this podcast, and forgive us if there's any glitches. For some reason, this is acting a little unusual. However, I wanted to say, go down in the description, like and subscribe to Myth Informed, the YouTube channel by Mythicist Milwaukee. Show them some love, because if it weren't for them, this debate wouldn't have happened. So thank you for that, and make sure you guys show them some love. Let's jump right into this thing, and here we go. So, Dr. Bob, let's start delving into some of the material that you think was missed during this debate. You didn't necessarily look at this as like a debate between Christians. However, it seemed like me watching the debate, there was like an apologetic historical angle that was being pushed rather than a skeptical one by Bart Ehrman. And there's so much. I was rewatching some of it, and I was like, oh my gosh, there's so much that I think people it missed and went over their head that you were pushing. Talk about the reasons why you don't buy what Bart's saying. And also, you have a book, Bart Ehrman Interpreted. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's kind of a play on one of his book titles, Jesus Interrupted. And the cover is even kind of a tongue-in-cheek salute to that, you might say. The exchange we had was a debate, and that in a way is unfortunate because, as I do in the book, I try to just clarify the differences between us, because I know good and well there are no easy and definitive answers for a question of ancient history with dubious sources that might be accurate or might not. It's delicate surgery to find some methodological keys to understand these sources and evaluate them. So I do not hold it as some kind of a fanatical dogma that Jesus cannot have existed or that it would have been better if he didn't. No, nor do I have any real skin in the game in terms of wanting mythicism to prevail in the academy and to become the dominant view. that is of no concern to me at all. I'm just interested in the issue as a matter of intellectual curiosity. And so that's one thing I want to get clear. But I do indeed have a different approach from Bart and most mainstream New Testament scholars. And by contrast, it does kind of make even the mainstream scholarship, the kind of people like in the Jesus Seminar, for instance, who so upset fundamentalists, it makes even them sound like they are apologists. In fact, one of my chapters is called Agnostic Apologist, because I'm trying to draw to illuminate the paradox that in all of Bart's other books dealing with the historical Jesus question, he comes so close to mythicism with the unreliability of the Gospels and of oral tradition and all that, that many of his fans were flabbergasted when they read his Did Jesus Exist? To learn that suddenly he was surprisingly positive about the historical worth of the Gospels. And I try to explain that that isn't really a contradiction. Bart is not contradicting himself exactly. It's just that he's sort of placing himself on the map, and I compared it to when you go to a doctor's office and they have you stand on that scale where they move the two counters a bit this way and a bit that way to exactly get you on there right to gauge your weight. And that's kind of what he's doing. He's distanced himself from the very conservative view that, for instance, his professor, the great Bruce Metzger, held, and on the other, back a little bit away from the mythicist view that Richard Carrier and Dave Fitzgerald and various others and I hold. So I think, he is more positive than he was about the Gospels, but he never meant to go so far as we do. And so I want to defend him on that. And in the book, Bart Ehrman Interpreted, I several times defend him from his critics that don't get it or are just arguing a party line. He and I are both critical New Testament scholars. Now, where we differ, let me just take a few of the points that are crucial in his book, Did Jesus Exist? And in his presentation. One was the idea that no one would have invented the notion of a crucified Messiah, somebody who dies at the hands of the victorious Romans. Now, in a sense, he admits somebody did invent it, but after the fact, as a kind of an ad hoc way of getting Jesus off the hook or off the cross. I mean, if they believed he was the Messiah and it turned out this way, which they didn't expect, but they don't want to abandon Jesus, like, cognitive dissonance reduction, they had to come up with an explanation. And they said, well, martyrs have died innocently to bear the sins of the Jewish people. Maybe that's what happened here, big time. But that's not a traditional Jewish view of the Messiah. And there I differ strongly, because it seems to me that it's no coincidence that all the major aspects of early Christology, the Christian belief about Jesus as the Messiah, though truly it does not fit rabbinic Judaism's job description for the Messiah, that is because as Judaism moved more closely toward monotheism, they had to reduce the proportions of the Messiah, who was originally the sacred king. That the Jewish monarchy. Well, what does the book of 1 Samuel tell us? That when some Jews said, we ought to have a king, things would get done better here. Look at Saul, for example. He really bailed us out. Don't we need somebody like that all the time? I mean, the other countries around here have a king. And Samson said, you don't know what you're asking for. There's really a downside of this, and you're not going to escape it. But if you insist, okay, how about Saul? Of course, more complex than that. So the institution of kingship, the Bible itself tells us, was borrowed from adjacent countries, big ones and small ones. You had the very similar sacred king myths in Babylon, in Canaan, and various other little countries around there whose documents we still have, like the Rosh Shamra texts in the Ugaritic language, and so on. And in all of these, what we have is what they call the royal ideology. The king was supposed to be like the vice regent of God on earth, to the point where he could be considered divine, a divinity and a royal authority renewed every autumn in the covenant renewal festival. Now, what was the idea of this? It was a dramatic recreation, or should we say reenactment, of a creation account that is not often recognized except by scholars, but occurs here and there in the Old Testament, the creation by combat myth. And in this, there is a threat posed to the old gods by a dragon or dragons who might even be considered the parents of the gods in some versions. But at any rate, the old gods are inadequate to deal with the threat of Leviathan or Tiamat or Behemoth or any other one with different names, different dragons. And so what are they going to do? Well, the young warrior god, who also is a storm god, because, a thunderstorm sounds like a battle in the heavens. Well, they said it was. The storm and warrior god steps forth, Marduk, Yahweh, Baal, various other names, and says, tell you what, I will take care of this monster and destroy him and save you if you meet my condition. I want to be recognized as the new king of gods. And they tell him, look, anything you want, go ahead. And so Marduk, or whoever, using his lightning bolts, his javelins, fights the chaos monster, and in the process is devoured by it, but manages to rise from the dead and burst his way out of the carcass of the dragon. And from the carcass, he creates the world, the earth, and so forth. And this is, you can find even this in the Old Testament, when it tells you how Yahweh became king of gods and founded his throne on justice and righteousness. And he made the north and the south. He made all the creatures and the mountains and all that. These elements go together because they're part of this consistent story, that the young warrior storm god became king of gods by killing the dragons and making the world out of them. Well, what I say, this was reenacted every New Year's festival when they needed to renew the power of the king. This was a seasonal thing. And just like James Frazier explained in The Golden Bough long ago, these stories presupposed that as the seasons succeeded one another and spring gave way ultimately to autumn and then winter, what this meant was that the vitality of the earth had been sapped away, and perhaps because of the sins of the people. But in either case, the king of God's earthly counterpart, the king sitting on the throne of Babylon or Canaan or Judah, whatever, he would symbolically undergo the battle with the chaos dragon, and then the death and resurrection by way of ritual humiliation. They'd have a bunch of guys dressed in a dragon outfit like you see in Chinese New Year parades, and they would go through the dance where the king would pretend to spear it and slay it, and then he would walk up the steps to the temple where he would meet the high priest, who would knock the crown off his head and slap him in the face to humiliate him, signifying the death of the the warrior god, but then and that was his atonement for the sins of the people that caused nature to shrivel and die. But then he would then regain his crown and step through the temple doors, where they believed he would ascend to heaven and be shown the tablets of destiny that would show him what must happen in the next year. Then he'd come back out and be acclaimed by the people as God's son and the savior and so forth. Look at Psalm 2, a coronation psalm, saying that the king is the anointed one, the Messiah. He's the Son of God. And there are other ones as well. So you have there a divine anointed or messianic king who is God's son and has battled the powers of evil and risen from his humiliating death to renew the power of nature and the divine mandate for his own rule. Of course, this was really handy if you were the king, right? Because you wouldn't really dare to question. Like the president today, everything the guy does, including what he has for breakfast, is assailed and criticized. You wouldn't have that in these monarchies, because, hey, look, the king, what he's doing may not look so good to you, but God told him to do it. You know better than God? No. And so this was very important. And this presages or anticipates what Christians said about Jesus as the Christ. He was the anointed one. He was the king of Israel, though, of course, he didn't actually rule, but should have, in triumphal entry and all that. He was the Son of God. He was the Christ. He had atoned for sins. He had died in battle with the principalities and powers, as Colossians tells us, and risen from the dead. And so it seems to me that this was the original Jewish idea of the Messiah. But as with many, many things, including polytheism, the Deuteronomic reform, that is the leadership faction that was responsible for much of the Old Testament being compiled, they kind of demythologized a lot of aspects of Jewish worship and theology. You can read great accounts of this in Margaret Barker's books, like The Gate of Heaven, about the role of the temple, or The Great Angel, about the ancient king myth and early Christology, because it didn't go away. It survived underground in popular theology. You find it in Gnosticism and in Philo-Judaeus and other places. Well, early Christianity was one of those places, and you can still see aspects of this in the New Testament, even outside of Christology, such as the seven-headed dragon in the book of Revelation. That's Leviathan, who's mentioned by name in various psalms and so on. So these archaic ideas never died off. They just kind of got demythologized by a more rationalistic type of Judaism that really revolutionized, giving us eventually rabbinic Judaism. Now, if all this is true, these early Christians had this in mind when they described Jesus as the Messiah, there's nothing novel in this. If you had this in mind for the Messiah, that's what Jesus would have to be. And so it seems to me there is a definite and elaborate and widely attested pre-Christian messianic role that pops up again in the New Testament.
It's interesting. You also mentioned, in this same vein of argument, because we're going to move into other topics in this debate that was brought up too, and things that were missed. But you mentioned the northern tribes and the southern tribes in our first take of trying to make this work with the internet wasn't working. You mentioned something that was significant to the Messiah of the northern tribes and the southern. Do you recall where that was?
That was about the Messiah ben Joseph. In, I think, a 3rd century rabbinic discussion preserved, I guess, in the Mishnah, they talk about how there are to be 2 Messiahs, one of the line of David from Judah in the south, and one from the line of Joseph in the north, from the Israel and Samaria, where the northern tribes had broken away from Judah and had their own royal line, their own monarchies. And they said that both had a role in the end times. The Messiah ben Joseph was a warrior, just like the other Messiah, but he was to die in battle against the Romans, etc. And this death, this valiant, heroic death, would atone for the sins of the people. This was a well-known classic piece of Jewish theology. Why the heck hasn't the Messiah come? Well, look in the mirror. It's because of us. We're such sinners, we've not shown ourselves worthy yet. And the rabbi said, if all Israel would just keep one stinking Sabbath day without violation, that'd be enough. The Messiah would throw off his disguise and appear and fight the Romans. And then once he had died, the slate is clean, and the Davidic Messiah of Judah is free to come kick the butt of the oppressors, and he would, and then, Jewish sovereignty and it will be restored, and the new age will dawn, and so forth. And now, where did they get this idea? Well, Geza Vermesh suggested that that Messiah ben Joseph was inspired by the valiant death of Simon Bar Kokhba, a Jewish self-proclaimed Messiah and ordained by Rabbi Akiva as the Messiah. He carried on a successful campaign against Rome and established Jewish independence, though it didn't last very long, and he was executed. They couldn't just laugh this guy off. Whoops, backed the wrong horse. I guess he wasn't the Messiah. No, he was a hero. So Vermesh says he thinks maybe that's where they came up with the idea. This guy was a Messiah, but he died, and that was no great shame because it was a heroic death. Why do you have to die? Because of sin, and he atoned for sin. Now, that's attested only in the 200s AD or CE. We don't know if it goes all the way back to New Testament times, but, these things aren't necessarily new in the first mention of them that we know of. So it's possible that that was already around, that you had the idea of a suffering and dying Messiah who would atone for the sins of Israel, though no one thought Bar Kokhba was resurrected. But Bart says it didn't exist in Judaism. Well, it sort of did, but I think really the survival of the sacred king myth really explains what was going on. This was already a delineated outline of what the Messiah would do. And so they, whatever, whether there was a Jesus who fulfilled it or the Jesus story is just putting names to this expectation. That's what's up for grabs. But my point is, there is evidence for a detailed Jesus-like Messiah who would die and so forth and rise. So it didn't take any great imagination to cook that up, and it wouldn't have sounded alien to many Jews. That's a major disagreement. I don't recall Bart addressing that, though he may have. For all I know, my memory's going.
I like what you said. You said something interesting when you were giving forward, because the first 30 minutes of the debate talks about his opening statement. Your opening statement, you brought forth something very fascinating, because it got hot real quick, that debate. You brought forth the notion that once you strip away the fable, because one thing we have to first start with here, Bart uses the Gospels as evidence, it seems, to some degree, like he thinks there's something there. Whereas like a lot of people I talk to, they're like, yeah, scratch the Gospels out. Let's go to Paul. Let's figure out who the Jesus was with Paul. That's what I hear a lot of people do. You're like, when you remove the fable, the Superman, what are you left with? Clark Kent. And then you started giving examples. You're like, okay, well, let's see where the historical significance of this story is. There were swine, and they were running down a hill, and they saw dogs or something, and they scattered and ran into the sea and drowned. And you're like, oh. And what was funny about these quotes is nothing in them seemed like, it was like, why would you remember that? Like you make the point that, okay, if all the mythology stuff isn't true, why are you writing if these insignificant portions are real history and the mythology's wiped away, why would they even write it? So what are some things you felt on top of what you just discussed here in the debate that he didn't address that you think you had some strong reasons and strong points that you just think even the audience may not have caught, but he especially didn't catch?
Yeah, the thing you just mentioned, the midrashic rewrites of these stories, let's see, Bart says in Did Jesus Exist that the coloring of the stories, the local color and the biblical style and so forth, it may be secondary. Okay, they may have embellished the stories, but there's a historical nucleus. Well, what is it? And I took about 7 different miracle stories, and okay, let's subtract the miracle, the feeding of the 5,000. Suppose everybody was hungry and they had enough food to feed everybody. Is that going to make it into the Gospels with no miracle when it exactly corresponds to Elisha feeding a bunch of people with a small amount of food? I mean, if that's not just coloring, that's the central event of the story. And so if you get rid of that, you've got no story. And the same with several other ones. Take away the supposed Old Testament coloring of it, you got nothing. And he said, oh, well, I didn't mean individual stories. I meant the whole general story. Though in his book, he quite clearly says, yes, individual stories. So I think he didn't really address that substantially. Another one was that I think just got ignored, if I'm remembering right, is the paradox of dating, that there would not have been. This is an old, tired evangelical apologist argument. That they say that F.F. Bruce and John Warwick Montgomery and others, they say, given the short span, they think it's short span of time between Jesus and the Gospels, you wouldn't have had time to have all these myths fabricated and these sayings falsely attributed to Jesus. Well, Bart shows very ably in Jesus Before the Gospels that that's really nonsense. It doesn't take any time for this kind of distortion to encrust the story of some hero or whatever. But there's a huge flaw in even Bart's argument, because if Jesus didn't exist, just hypothetically, you can't measure how much time went by between the historical existence of Jesus and these stories about him. The bottom falls out. What we know in the Gospels are written more or less, but if Jesus was a mythic figure that grew. Who knows how and who knows when it would have started, there's no way you can map out that time period. So, and he refers to that again and again. Well, I didn't hear any real response to that, and to me that's enough to practically to be a death blow to that argument. Yet another one was the issue of how mythicists say that certain New Testament passages in Paul, like the one about James, the brother of the Lord, and the Last Supper scene in First Corinthians, and several others, that mythicists say, well, these must have been interpolations. These stories, these mentions imply that Paul, or whoever the writer was, knew about the career of Jesus. Okay, he doesn't say much about it, but in these places, he certainly seems to presuppose a historical Jesus. I pointed out that none of those interpolation theories were the work of mythicists. Mythicism was around, but I explained exactly by name who had suggested each one of these 7 or so. They weren't mythicists. They weren't axe grinding. It was phenomena in the text, discontinuities, differences in vocabulary, and so forth, where non-mythicists had said, yeah, this appears not to be original to the letter. zip, no attention to that, at least as I remember. And that is another major blow to this. So on and on it went, but those are some of the major things that I thought were not really dealt with, and are very important in undermining the historicist's case.
You actually talk about, you say, the Superman Clark Kent
Oh
argument.
yeah,
That one went over a lot of people's heads. The way you were trying to really break that down.
yeah. That's if you go back to the business about how did Jesus exist? Oh, there's no evidence for him. Well, Bart and many others say, well, that's no surprise, because if we're talking about a non-supernatural historical Jesus who was a prophet and a wise man, but didn't do miracles, what notice would ancient writers have taken of him? I mean, people like this were sort of a dime a dozen. In fact, I used to think that made some sense, but then I realized, since they were a dime a dozen and Jesus didn't merit the attention of outsiders, why would insiders have been so bewitched with him? I mean, what made them think that he was the son of God and all that stuff, if the character was originally just Clark Kent? It's like if you said, let's see if there was a historical Superman. Well, of course, we can't really believe a guy could fly through the air, be invulnerable to bullets, have X-ray vision, and all this. Oh, of course, that's just fabrication. But there was a Superman, and what do we know about him? Well, he used to wear glasses and a blue suit, and was a reporter for a great metropolitan newspaper. Who would have based a hero on this guy? And it just seems to me that that is another damning objection to all of these liberal historical Jesus theories. And you know what they're based on? There was a sermon by Harry Emerson Fosdick, the great leader of liberal Protestantism decades ago, a sermon called The Personality of Jesus. And they a lot of these old guys said that, okay, those supernatural didn't really happen, we're mythical. What was the big thing about Jesus? Oh, what a guy he was, what a moral people. And what was they just couldn't believe he was gone. It's like I've been to funerals where people say, so and so's still with us, he's here with us. Yeah, you wish. And that's the same kind of thing that the liberal Protestants said about Jesus. Well, did he actually come out of the tomb? No, of course not. But the personality of Jesus, what is this, the Elvis cult? I mean, it's just based on a particular kind of gushy humanistic theology. It has no historical origin as a theory. And they just, a lot of liberals, liberal theologically, have not yet realized that. Just like William Lane Craig and the evangelical apologists still have not caught on that they seem to think they're arguing with 18th century Protestant rationalists. Oh, well, everybody knows the Gospels are accurate, and if it's accurate all the way up to the empty tomb, how else can you explain the empty tomb except by a supernatural resurrection? So admit it. That's an absurd argument. Like this great Jesus and Mo cartoon I always quote, where Jesus is saying, well, what about the empty tomb? That proves I rose from the dead. And Mo says, you can't defend the story by other elements in the same story. It's like saying the Emerald City must exist, because otherwise, where would the yellow brick road lead? And that's right. You can't assume that, like they did in the 18th century, liberal or conservative, but apologists are stuck on that. The Jesus Seminar type liberals are stuck on the early 20th century romanticism of a great guy, Jesus. And they need to grow up and get out of those delusions.
See, and the more I immerse myself in this subject, which I've been doing now for quite some time, I'm finding more and more the things you've been saying for a long time are actually starting to, I understand them now. I don't know why it's taken me so long to start understanding some of the things you've been saying. But anyway, that I don't want to detract away from this discussion because the debate, you did your opening statement and you brought a lot of stuff that a lot of people, I think you said eventually, like, did it bore them to death? Did they just did they miss this, what I'm building up? There's a case that you made, and Bart Ehrman came with a mission, an apologetic mission to prove that Jesus was historical, and he used all this evidence to try and do so. And so it seemed like he had a more convincing case to a lot of people. Now, when you guys finally go back and forth in your discussions, I love to open this question up, but I know Bart never would. The Pauline epistles, how much weight does he lean on these Pauline epistles to make his Jesus historical? And would you also say this is once again one of those things where his own books are showing there's issues here, and non-mythicists are saying, look at a lot of this stuff. There's issues in Paul. Why are you trusting these sources for this Jesus? I mean, what would you do with the Pauline epistles in this case against Ehrman?
Well, I would say, as I did, I think that a lot of the relevant stuff, it tends to look like it's interpolated or misinterpreted. Like, suppose the text of Galatians did originally have Paul saying that he had met James, the brother of the Lord. Are we so sure that would mean he met the blood sibling of Jesus? I mean, it would make sense that way, but it would make sense in other ways too. Now, he pokes fun at what Richard Carrier says, and I think he's correct. Bart is that when Richard says, well, all Christians were brothers and sisters of the Lord Jesus, maybe that's all it means. Well, no. Can you really imagine that in the context he's saying, I met none of the other apostles except Cephas and James, our Christian brother? Nobody would bother saying that. I mean, obviously, if he's an apostle, he's a Christian. So I agree, but there are other ways of seeing that. There is good reason, though, as with all these things, it's pretty skimpy. It's all fragments, but there are references to the brothers of the Lord, three pretty strong ones. One in First Corinthians, he says, do Barnabas and I not have the right to take with us a sister as wife, a fellow Christian, as do Cephas and the brothers of the Lord? Well, does that mean the blood brothers of Jesus? It might, but it doesn't necessarily if it means a particular group. I think it does. That it's like Matthew 25 with the sheep and goats story. Jesus says to the goats, "The hell with you! Go to the fire prepared for the devil and his angel." Why? Well, because when you saw me, you didn't lift a finger to help me. I was in jail. I was sick. I was hungry. I was naked, and you didn't lift a finger. And they go, "We never saw you in such straits." Oh, yes, you did. Remember that the least of these my brethren, that was me. Well, who are his brethren? Modern humanistic Christianity likes to read that as meaning street people, etc. Well, that's kind of good. That's fortunate in a way, but it's really an application. The original intent must have been that his missionaries were rebuffed in their travels. You know how in the mission charge that you have about 4 times in the first 3 gospels, don't take a money belt, you can take a staff, but don't take 2 cloaks, don't wear sandals, etc. Wherever they are willing to take you in and feed you, don't be picky. The blessing of God will hover over their house. But if they don't, well, you shake the dust off your feet and say, look, you don't say you weren't warned when the kingdom of God comes. Now that, as George Ladd and Evangelical and others have shown, fits best the wandering missionaries in the early church, that they rejected the preaching of the wandering brethren. He refers to them as the least of his brethren. Third John also speaks of itinerant prophets and preachers that have gone out in the name of Jesus, and it says it refers to them as the brethren. Well, of course, he's talking to Christians anyway, so he can't merely mean we ought to help all Christians. The whole context is the wandering apostles. And so it seems to me it's a very good likelihood that even if it did say that he saw no one but Cephas and James, the Lord's brother, he's saying, well, one's an apostle, one's an evangelist. At least that possibility is good enough to mean you cannot just produce that verse as a trump card for saying, yeah, you see, Jesus must have existed because Paul knew one of his relatives. And he never saw the beaver, but he did see Wally. I mean, it might mean that, but that's a pretty slim read on the basis of which to rule out mythicism. And I showed other possibilities too, but he didn't go for them.
Yeah, he didn't. He didn't touch on a lot of those. What I did notice is he tries to collect all this information, and here's all this overwhelming evidence for this Jesus. He's the most attested man in history, or at least in the first century. He had all this apologetic type style coming forward with his position, and you guys didn't get too much into extra biblical, but I know he mentioned that there's this extra biblical source material to try and add weight to what he was saying about a historical Jesus. Did he miss anything you were bringing forward on that? Or can you think of anything, even if that's not relevant to something you'd like to bring up about in the debate?
Well, for instance, with Josephus, he knows that as it stands, it cannot have been the work of Josephus. Josephus couldn't have said, yeah, he was the Christ, when he owed his whole position in the government to proclaiming Vespasian the Messiah. That just can't be. So he does what a lot of liberal critics do and say, well, we do kind of need this passage as evidence that a non-Christian mentioned Jesus, but maybe it was interpolated by Christians. Josephus didn't say he was the Messiah. Maybe he said he could have been the Messiah. Maybe he didn't say this and that, namely all the stuff that is obviously Christian. But what he had left was he was a wise philosopher and so on. And that the whole Christian group is named after him, and it survives to this day. How could the Christians be named after a guy that you haven't told us was the Christ? And he hadn't, if this liberal selective interpolation theory is true. And the mere suggestion of it is ironic, because when mythicists and others say that they think this passage in Galatians, or that one in First Corinthians, that seem to presuppose a historical Jesus, they were interpolations. They say, oh, no, you don't. If we don't actually have manuscript evidence, actual copies that lack these phrases, we got to assume that they were originally there. Well, suddenly that changes diametrically when it's Josephus. He could have been interpolated. Oh, yeah, because we need that passage. And it just seems to me that is a contradiction, in my opinion. And why this approach? Like, why is he the agnostic apologist? I think he just is in the same plausibility structure as Peter Berger calls it. You're in a kind of a professional peer group, and there are certain things that are not options. And it's not as if Bart doesn't know there is such a thing, because he frankly admits, I think in the debate, but also in this book, that he would join others who would make sure no mythicist scholar ever got a job in a decent seminary or university, because that's too crackpot. And then, of course, they turn it right around and say, well, how do you know it's crackpot? Well, because we don't believe it. And it's just the double-edged sword, the peer pressure on the one hand and the appeal to the majority on the other. So it seems to me that he can't think out of that box. I don't mean he's stupid. It's just that certain things will not seem plausible to you depending on what group you're in. I know I found this at different stages of leaving evangelicalism. Once I dared think certain things, more things began to seem natural, and I think, how did I not see this before? Well, I had an interest in it not being true. Now I don't, and it looks different. So who knows? I mean, I say the guy is a great scholar, and I love his work and defend his work, but in this instance, I just don't understand why he feels free to literally laugh the stuff off.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, after looking at this, sometimes I am torn between, the two positions, to be honest. I'll hear something and it makes me wonder, but based off of extra biblical evidence, if I was to use Tacitus and I was to use Suetonius as some type of evidence on top of Josephus, it appears to me that if there was a guy named Chrestus, as Tacitus supposes, that chronologically speaking, he doesn't fit in the right place. If you use Suetonius to try and say Chrestus and the Christians and look at Tacitus, it seems like even then the biblical chronology is not right. Does Bart take into account that maybe this guy didn't exist in the 30s, or does he take a traditional view and say, no, this guy really existed around the exact time the Gospels say he existed? And I don't know how that works. Do you have anything that doesn't make sense of where this guy is supposed to exist in real history? Because I've heard you make the quote that the Talmud makes a statement that the guy lived 100 BC or 70-something BC, which is...
and the church father and heresiologist Epiphanius, or Epiphanius, however the heck you say it, he also held that view that Jesus lived in the first century BC or BCE, and he thought that the Jewish version of the Nativity was sort of correct, that Jesus' father was not Pandera, the Roman soldier, but that he did have like a grandfather named Pandera. So he's sort of a bridge between the Jewish polemic against Christianity and what the church fathers say. But there were varying estimates as to when Jesus had lived and died. Claudius, the guy that expelled Jews from Rome because of the rabble rousing of Chrestus, he was in the 40s, and oddly enough, Irenaeus, the great heresy fighter, he said that Jesus lived to be nearly 50 years old and died in the reign of none other than Claudius. But there's no reason at all to make Suetonius's Chrestus into Christos, because Chrestus was a common name. We know of various individuals named that. It meant useful or good. It could also refer to one's occupation. It could imply carpenter or plasterer. And so there's loads of Chrestuses around. The similarity to Christus, I mean, and as some manuscripts, Tacitus calls the founder of Christianity Chrestus too, and so did Marcion. He thought Jesus was not the Messiah, but he was the son of the loving God, the Heavenly Father, and he was the good, not the Messiah, but the good one. And who knows? I mean, nobody really has enough information to sort this stuff out, but that again simply reinforces we have very little to go on. And so I admit that mythicism is tenuous, but I think historicism is even more so. You just don't know until somebody comes up with some definitive evidence, if they ever do.
I love this though. I love the question. I love how mythicism's trying to show why this isn't reliable to be historical in the way that it's being, I guess you say, dealt with right now. At the best, we should have a histomythicist type of at least middle ground. You would hope or suspect. I know that sounds contradictory because mythicists, if you take the Doherty thesis, have angelic or heavenly being euhemerized, and then vice versa, a man being god-like or created into a legend and enshrouded into deity form from the historicist angle. However, what I'm saying is at the bottom of this, if there is history and this is a myth, I would think like a histomythicist type of position would make sense. Did you deal with the Doherty thesis in this debate in any way with him and the angelic Jesus? Because I know he mocks your position of the idea of archons being angels, and he tries to say how ridiculous. I mean, this is flesh and blood crucifixion, flesh and blood on earth, bodily brothers, in the physical realm. They were born to parents, and he takes everything down to the earth. And he does, if there's any type of deity or angelic stuff, he probably suspects it was added to this character. Whereas you're saying there's proto-Christianity, there's Old Testament ideas, there's a lot of mythology, even in the Old Testament, that gives way to this Jesus character and builds this case for why this would be a heavenly being coming down rather than it being an actual man and then trying to legendize this guy. Did you guys go into that, or do you have anything you'd like to add?
We didn't. I guess we got into it to the extent we talked about whether the gospel stories are entirely rewrites of Old Testament material, and that's when he said, "Well, I just mean the Jesus story in general, but there are individual stories that have a historical core," which is not what he said in the book, just the opposite. But there's one thing I would like to have mentioned was, how I talk about how Zoroastrianism was a major influence on post-exilic Judaism, and that was probably because that kind of Judaism was really a sort of Judaized version of Zoroastrianism imposed on the people by Ezra and Nehemiah, who were themselves, though Jews, were agents of the Persian emperor, which is why in the second Isaiah, Cyrus is called my anointed one, my Messiah, and so on. And it's also why the sect of Jews that are so often mentioned in the Gospels are Pharisees, which may well be simply another spelling of Parsees, the term still used in India today for Zoroastrians, because their religion was Persian. The resurrection of the dead, the final judgment, a virgin-born future Messiah who would raise the dead, the apocalyptic timetable until the end. These things were the guardian angel idea. Their angels always behold the face of my Father, and all of that seems to have been imposed on Hebrew religion after the exile by these Zoroastrian agents. And that's not far-fetched, and it seems to me that's the only way to explain the origin of Pharisaism, which survived as rabbinic and then Orthodox Judaism. Okay, now if that's the case, you, as many history of religion school writers once freely admitted, the notion of Jesus as the Son of Man, based, of course, on the book of Daniel and the book of Enoch, is as a cosmic deliverer. That would come from the Seo-Shians, the benefactor, the virgin-born successor of Zoroaster, and the See, I forget the last piece of this puzzle now. Okay. And this further goes back into Vedic Hinduism, the root from which Zoroastrianism grew, where they have creation accomplished by the cosmic man, which is pretty much the same thing as the Son of Man or the heavenly Adam in apocalyptic Judaism. He sacrificed himself in the heavens in order to create all the castes of Indians, the scriptures, the physical world, and so forth. He died in the heavens when there was as yet no earth. There are various types of Gnosticism that say the primal man was set upon and dismembered by the archons, which gave life to the world. I think that's really the immediate origin of the story of Jesus' sacrificial death at the hands of the principalities and powers that gave life to the world. So there are precedents and parallels. He's trying to make mythicists believe that Jesus was Ray Walston, my favorite Martian, up in outer space, as he likes to put it. That's not the idea, and it's not a modern innovation. And as with the whole sacred king thing, this is often ignored by the school of New Testament scholars he belongs to.
I love this. I really do, because it takes syncretism and it shows, because it seems like he's dealing more with the immediate ideas and trying to suggest, hey, this is purely Jewish. This is just like, there's no, don't get too fantastic. Don't try and think outside the box. This is a Jewish movement, and let's just focus on that. I even saw, and I'm just going to plug this, I saw a 2.5-minute clip on a show, I forget the name of it. It's a YouTube channel where Dennis McDonald is being asked about Bart Ehrman and how Bart Ehrman views his book on the Homeric epics and the Gospels. And he says that Bart doesn't even mention. He never quotes Dennis. In fact, he handed him his book hoping he would read it, and he thinks he did. But he does not at all quote him ever since. And he goes, I don't know how this guy could not quote me, because he says, even if I'm wrong in some of these things that I assume, the evidence is so overwhelming that there is a borrowing from Homer and these Homeric epics that you would think someone as top notch as Ehrman would at least agree. It's like he wants to stay tunnel visioned into a Jewish idea only, so much so, let's ignore any syncretism as best we can. Let's avoid a Persian outset. Let's avoid a Greco-Roman mythology being tied into this Jewish thing. Let's just say if there's anything there, it was way later. There's no way this thing had any possible precedence right there at the very beginning. So we'll just say there was forgeries and there was this and that. But no, they never had this idea originally. And it's kind of like that. That's what I was getting from it. I don't know if. Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, that's exactly right. This is an apologetics standard where, for canonical reasons, you want Christianity to grow out of Old Testament Judaism. You don't want any pollution by Gnosticism or mystery religions or whatever, because that raises problems. It begins to raise the ghost of syncretism. And why is that a problem? Well, because it needn't be a revelation. They want to claim roots in Judaism and yet show how dissimilar it was to Judaism, to work both sides of the street. It's like they want it to be Old Testament and New Testament and nothing else. And this is a kind of canonical apologetic. This is what I think led Bart's professor, Bruce Metzger, to deny that there were any pre-Christian dying and rising gods. And Bart says the same thing, though this is demonstrably not true. And he just, it seems to me, to be stuck in the apologetics thing. I don't think he will forever. I mean, he's already begun to say, well, maybe the empty tomb wasn't historical. And I suspect you're going to hear more of that. And who knows how far he'll go.
Did he go swoon theory route, or how does he in particular deal with the empty tomb at this moment that you know of?
I don't know, but he could very well have embraced the view of John Dominic Crossan and others that the Romans just threw the body of the crucified Jesus into a lime pit, which they often did with the crucified, and so that which could have happened. But I suspect that's what he thinks happened, that those who had Jesus crucified also got rid of him, and his followers probably didn't even know where the body was.
See, I find I find what you're saying is very complex, and it's very hard to follow when you're not aware of the argument. It is, because, if you start with this Paul crucified Jesus. This doesn't mean by the Romans. You get so much of the Gospels in your mind,
right?
You immediately start thinking Roman crucifixion. And then one of the things that I think, to me, when you start taking a skeptical route, is why the historicists have some weight on their side, even though there's more questions than answers, is that they're taking stuff possibly from historian Josephus and relevant contemporary things that really did happen, like, for example, the 3 men who die on the cross, right? Jesus and 2 thieves. Mm-hmm. Well, what's interesting about that in the Gospels is these happen on crosses, okay? It is a Roman crucifixion. Well, when you do midrash and you go into the Old Testament and you see that this is happening right there in the story of Joseph, like I mentioned before, how you have the man who's the bread bearer, the guy, the baker, and then you have the wine bearer, and you see the dungeon, you see the story, the narrative is a copy of Joseph. Both of them resurrect, one to eternal death, one to eternal life. That same narrative is going on here in the Gospels. The only thing that roots us into history is the fact that maybe whoever wrote these New Testament Gospels is borrowing a narrative from either Josephus, because remember, Josephus had 3 people that were crucified that were his friends, and one of them survives. So it could simply be a hijacking of contemporary things utilized into a mythological narrative like this. And I kind of think that makes more sense, because you can't, if you're looking at this thing historically, how can you not see Joseph? How can you not see the baker, the wine bearer? How can you not see that Jesus being seated at the right hand of God as Joseph in the Old Testament being seated at the right hand of Pharaoh? I just can't get rid of that in my mind. At the same time, trying to say, well, this
well,
guy, yeah. Well, I know.
Well, what Christian apologists have always said is that it all happened with Jesus and with Joseph, and it's typology, that it's a designed correspondence between 2 sets of historical events. What the purpose of that could possibly be, I don't know, but that's what they've always said.
Of course they would.
Whereas what we're saying is that the story, the ancient fictions, have been rewritten into slightly less ancient fictions.
Yeah, I think that you're right on that one. Is there anything else you can recall that in the debate? Because I know that a lot more is not being touched now, and we'll do a follow-up show to delve into the details. And in fact, I'll go and I'll write down these particulars in the next podcast. That way we finish off the debate that you guys did and really cover every point, because a lot of people watched that. And I know that your purpose is not to try and advance the kingdom of mythicism. At the same time, I don't think it's fair that everyone sees this 2 hours and thinks they understand that mythicism is ridiculous. They really haven't dealt with this long enough to even make a judgment like that, in my opinion.
I agree. They need to take a closer look at it. Though again, for all I care, they don't have to. Just it doesn't really matter in the big scheme of things. But if we are discussing this, you have to do it fairly.
Yeah. So, any points that you think were brought up that you wanted to touch on? Because I know in your book you reinterpret, or you interpret, Bart, which everybody needs to get that book to really see how you view this. But is there anything you can remember?
Gee, no, I can't really. I did think that I differ with them on a number of other points as to whether it's clear that Jesus is even supposed to be a preacher of the apocalypse, which Albert Schweitzer and Rudolf Bultmann and others suggested with amazingly cogent and ingenious arguments, but which is now sort of passe, which doesn't mean it's not true. But Bart certainly embraces that as first book that I was familiar with, Jesus, apocalyptic preacher, apocalyptic prophet of the new millennium. He certainly takes that standpoint, and I spend a good bit of time suggesting that, trying to show how the passages invoked in favor of that are highly dubious, the way they're interpreted, or whether they're authentic, even if there was a historical Jesus. I try to show how that he cannot have said this and that, even if he did exist. So there's a lot of stuff he says that I differ over, though that doesn't directly bear on Jesus existing. There probably was more, but that's all I can think of at the moment.
I got one more before we close this one down, because I know we're going to have to do a follow-up. There's a lot that we didn't cover, and I will analyze the debate and go into the details and make sure that we have all the remaining questions to deal with. My last thing is this. Do you think that if Bart Ehrman had read all your works, that he might have a little bit more reason to doubt?
It's possible. I don't know what he did read of mine, and I really have no way of knowing. I know that at some point writing this book, he had, as a lot of scholars do, had his graduate assistants compile material for him to look at, and you have to hope that it's representative stuff. It might not be. So I don't know what he actually did read, and nor do I blame him for taking that approach. You can't read everything germane to it, but I don't know if he got a good dose of my ravings or not.
Interesting. I love this stuff. I really do, and I appreciate you coming on. Look, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Robert McNair Price, thank you for joining me on the show, and it's been an honor. It really has.
Oh, it's an honor to be on such a forum.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Look, guys, gals, go down into the description. The book, Bart Ehrman Interpreted by Dr. Robert McNair Price. You guys got to get a copy. Come check it out. See how he views the scholar, okay, and how he's looking at the situation. I definitely need to go through and read this myself. But the debate that happened, man, that stirred up a lot of controversy. So go down. Mythicist Milwaukee is under Myth Informed. Subscribe to them. Get the book with Dr. Price for sure. We're going to do more shows. And if you guys like what you're hearing, look, go give PayPal to Dr. Bob and say, Dr. Bob, we want you back on Myth Vision. Because right now, him and his wife are both now at home, and you guys can hear more from him. Also, I definitely want to plug this one. He is taking courses one-on-one with anyone who wants to come for 1 hour a week at this moment, and he'll shut that down if we get too many, but you might as well get in while you can. And for a fee, he'll spend an hour with you, take you through the Bible. I even have people who literally said, well, will Dr. Bob be willing to listen to some things I have to present? I said, he's as much of a student as he is a teacher, so I'm sure if you're willing to pay for his time, he would be more than happy to listen to what you have to say. So go check him out. That description.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Email is criticus@aol.com. and that'll be down in the description too as well. And thank you for joining.